Hey everyone, Adrian here. If I sound a little bit different than I do in the rest of the episodes, because I'm recording this slightly separately, because we have content warning at the beginning of this episode, and I wasn't quite happy with the recording that I did when we were actually recording the episode. So, real quick, just be aware, if you are not familiar with Parasite Eve or any of the media surrounding the video game, we're going to be talking about some pretty heavy topics today, including but not limited to rape, sexual assault, and forced pregnancy. If that doesn't sound like a good time for you, then you may want to skip today's episode. We have another great one for next month. We're looking at our first modern game, Hollow Body. I'll just let everybody know now. For everyone else sticking around, we do hope that you enjoy today's episode despite some unpleasant topics that we're covering. And now, on with today's episode and Parasite Eve. I'm Adrian Sandoval.
And I'm Lamont Williams.
And we are playing Dread. And wow, I am really excited about this episode because we get to talk about stuff that's not just horror games, oddly. That might sound a little bit weird, but of course we are talking about one horror game in particular, and that is Parasite Eve. This is a game that I think a lot of people were baffled by at the time. That I don't actually think is that baffling, but we're going to get into it a little bit more. If you're not 100% familiar, what Square Soft, as they were called at the time, dubbed the cinematic RPG, which is kind of funny because this is post Final Fantasy VII. Square was already very familiar with making a very cinematic RPG, but this one was cinematic for various different reasons we're going to talk about today. But yeah, Lamont.
Yeah.
As always, before we dive right into it, I gotta ask you, do you remember your first encounter with this game? Was the first time you heard about Parasite Eve? When was the first time that you played it? I'm kind of curious what your answer is to this one.
So, Adrian, I think you're going to notice a trend with me and a lot of these games. And they all start with a word video, with like my favorite place to rent games. So, let me first start with I think at the time of this game coming out, I had played Final Fantasy VII, um and I was on an an RPG kick. Like, I needed more RPGs than my body could handle.
As was everyone around the time Final Fantasy VII came out, but go on.
Oh, and absolutely. And so, seeing that Squaresoft logo and knowing that, like, oh, this is gonna be another RPG, and the box art is really what got me. Because I didn't know anything about the game. I saw Squaresoft, I saw the box art, and I was like, cool. It's another, RPG for me to check out. And I remember starting it and like just being mind blown by that opening. And I don't think I realized that it was like horror at the time. And I like I was such a like chicken when it came to horror. Like, I loved Resident Evil, I loved horror games, but I was also like terrified of everything. So I did not actually get very far in Parasite Eve when I played it. I got through the opera, and then like people were getting set on fire, and that was unnerving. And then I got into like the jump through the hole, and was like in the like dressing rooms, and then when crispy bodies started to just appear in the hallway, I got so scared that like I couldn't keep going.
Did you even make it to the first FMV with the mutating rat?
I did.
Okay,
I
because
did.
I imagine that one had to be like super traumatic, and I was kind of curious if you had had any experience with something we're going to be talking about a lot today, bio horror and particularly body horror, and the way that they like really like that is just one very gruesome FMV.
Oh my god, is Absolutely, and at the time, no, I did not have any history with, with biohorror and body horror. I think, you know, maybe in some ways that, in a tame way, there was a what was that game? It was a fighting game. It was like Bio something. Um, uh,
Biofreaks,
I think it
maybe?
was Bio Freaks. It was Bio Freaks. That was like the extent of any kind of body horror, bio horror stuff that I had going on. I guess, you know, Toxic Avengers, not even the Toxic Crusader, we're talking about the cartoon, that had some weird bio stuff going on, but it wasn't scary.
I do think it's interesting that you mentioned Resident Evil before this, which maybe not so much that first game, but Resident Evil 2 absolutely has a lot of very gruesome body horror. And I was kinda curious if you might remember if you had played Resident Evil 2 prior to Parasite Eve at all. But
I don't know.
yeah, because like, that's another one that I can think of that had, like, some pretty gruesome stuff in it, not necessarily in the FMVs themselves, but even, like, within, like, the real-time part of the game, there's parts with people getting ripped in half and such, but we'll talk more about that when we talk about Resident Evil 2 in the future, because I think it makes an interesting comparison to how they did things in the remake.
What
Um,
year did Resident Evil 2 come out? Like,
I
did
wanna
that come
say it
out?
was I believe it was 1997, or it might have been 1998, which is the same year Parasite Eve came out. I'm gonna look it up right now. I did not prepare to research Resident Evil 2 beginning of this episode. Yeah, Resident Evil 2, of course, the first thing I see is 2019. 1998. So same year as Parasite Eve.
Ooh,
Yeah, you will
that's
know.
interesting.
Yeah,
So,
I
I
mean,
think I
you
may have played Parasite
mhm.
Eve first.
Yeah, that's very possible. Like, you're gonna start as we whenever we talk about the PlayStation era of survival horror and horror games, there are a lot of trends and tropes that carry forward between all of them. We talked about Silent Hill last month, and I'm gonna bring up that episode in particular a lot in this one because I think there are a lot of connections there. But the one thing that was different about Silent Hill compared to a lot of the horror at the time was focus on genetic engineering and that kind of scientific mix of horror. Something I was going to talk a little bit about later on in the episode, but I think it's worth just kind of like bringing up now. There's a reason why you see a lot of this in this era of Japanese horror, not just in not just in video games, but also in movies and in books and things like that. Like, to be clear, science fiction and horror have always had sort of a symbiotic relationship. Symbiotic. It
Aha.
fits with the theme. I've always had something of a symbiotic relationship. Like as far back as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and probably even further than that, right? And bio horror, the works of David Cronenberg and such, have always been an influence or have been a strong influence on Japanese horror as well. Another game series based on a series of novels, which if you didn't know, because we haven't gotten into that far yet, Parasite Eve, based on a novel, is similar to Megami Tensei. Megami Tensei also, which I will say right now, we'll cover that series as well as its novel another day.
Can't
But
wait for that one.
I will also say that, having read most of Megami Tensei and now having read all of Parasite Eve for this podcast, Parasite Eve owes a lot to Megami Tensei. But that like combination of sci-fi horror was always kind of there. I think that with Parasite Eve, the novel, the game, and some of the other games that we've mentioned, like Resident Evil, this is where we start to like really see the focus on like genetic horror, DNA horror. Like that's where things are a little bit different here. And it is very particular of this era. And, I think that part of the reason is a lot of the topics in the news at the time, such as Dolly the sheep, which the sheep that was cloned in 1996. That caused a lot of conversation over here in the United States. One of the central controversies that we're going to talk about when we talk about the Parasite Eve novel was the conversation of organ transplants in Japan. Is a That's a big focus on the novel. All of these conversations are happening at the same time. And in mass media, I think one really, really big influence that affected all of video games, but also very much Square in this period of time. Squaresoft, we'll say. Square has so many different names throughout the years, but that's not worth getting into here. Neon Genesis Evangelion. Let's just rip that band-aid off right now. That had a
Oh,
huge influence across all of Japanese media, and Square was not at all immune to it.
I didn't even consider that, but you make such a good point in that, thinking about, like, Xenogears now, like, okay.
Yeah, right, another RPG that came out around this period of time that obviously very heavily influenced by Evangelion, but even, Final Fantasy VII feels like it's got a touch of Evangelion inside of it, right? Inside of its story and such. And I think all of these things are kinda converging at once. Now, the novel that we're talking about today, Parasite Eve, is from 1996, so it's also arguable that, like, Parasite Eve also sorta kicked a lot of this off. One of the themes of today's episode is that this is all stuff that you and me had no context for playing Parasite Eve in 1998 because the book is from 1996, and it was hugely popular in Japan, and no one read it here until 2005,
Yeah.
which is shocking to me. Simply that, like, I would have assumed that after the popularity of the game, and Parasite Eve was a popular game here, that the book would have gotten that localization, and certainly by the time we get the Ring remake. But no, like, it took forever for Parasite Eve to actually get the novel localized over here. As is pretty much tradition here in the United States for us, millennials and elder millennials to have a portion of that culture be something that we're completely blind to. So we're getting this kinda, like, spotty look at things, from playing the sequel to a novel that we've never read to, Japanese games taking a couple of years to get localized before they come here, this is all fairly common for us in the United States, which also makes it very difficult for us to actually try to, like, kinda do what we're gonna be doing today in today's podcast, which is to try and look and try to, like, kind of find how these puzzle pieces work through our limitations of our personal histories, as well as the fact that we just don't speak the language.
And honestly, when I was trying to learn about this, like, a lack of real development history, like, for this particular game, it feels like they weren't talking about the actual development of it very much.
No, absolutely not. So all of these things we're gonna jump into. We've definitely gotten ahead of my plans and my notes here, which is fine. I kinda love the off the cuff conversation. What I just wanna say really quickly is that, like, for myself with Parasite Eve, it's funny to me because I don't actually really remember much about when I first played Parasite Eve. I just know it was pretty soon after I got my first PlayStation. And it's weird for me just because I typically have a pretty good memory about these things. I mentioned last month my story of about Resident Evil and getting into the PlayStation because of horror games. So I don't recap all of that. What I will say is that I remember when I bought my PlayStation. I bought my PlayStation with my own money, well, Christmas money anyway, in late December of 1998, and I bought that PlayStation with a copy of Xenogears, which we already mentioned. Because by the time we get to 1998, I have been RPG pilled for a long time by this point. It predates Final Fantasy VII. I didn't even play Final Fantasy VII for a couple more years after I got the PlayStation. I was more excited about Xenogears because I knew it was a lot of the Chrono Trigger team. The RPG forums I was on America Online at the time was full of a lot of old hats who were very much like, "Nah, Final Fantasy VII, that game's not that great, not as good as Final Fantasy VI, but you gotta play Xenogears." Like, that was actually the attitude of people on this forum, which is bizarre, I think, for a lot of people in hindsight, even people who've played RPGs for a long time. Like, Xenogears never really had that much of a great reputation, but yeah, this forum that I was on, like, really hyped up Xenogears for me, and it had, like, the same pedigree that I look for in RPGs, which is basically the Chrono Trigger people. This is all a long way winded way of saying that by the time I got my PlayStation, Parasite Eve had been out. I knew about the game because, again, video game magazines. I knew about the game, I knew what it was. There were also a lot of commercials at the time, so if you watched a lot of TV or something, you most certainly knew about it because Square, just like Final Fantasy VII, put a lot into the marketing for this game. Again, it feels kind of strange because the game is a sequel to a novel that we didn't get here in the United States. But Square did not only localized it here in the US, which they didn't localize all of their RPGs that came out on the PlayStation, but they localized this one and they put a bunch of marketing into it, and it paid off because the game did very well for itself. So that's kind of my history with it, but I do want to actually dive a little bit deeper into this because I actually think that understanding, again, not an RPG podcast, even though this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. I would even say, Lamont, like maybe we should do an RPG podcast, but I wouldn't want to step on the toes of other like great ones out there. Axe of the Blood God being my personal favorite. But I do think that before we dive into Parasite Eve itself, I think kind of understanding Square, at least from the perspective of us, us who grew up with it, actually is kind of important to understanding Parasite Eve.
No, I think
So,
you're right.
I've been talking for a while, so I'm gonna ask you, Lamont, first. So you told us your personal history with Parasite Eve. Now I'm kinda curious, you had mentioned that you were already big into RPGs because of Final Fantasy VII, or at least, like, by that point, you were kinda, like, trying to play as many as you could and such. I'm just kinda curious to hear, in general, what your personal history with Square as a company was, because by the time we get to Parasite Eve, and because of Final Fantasy VII, they were everywhere, but not everybody started with Final Fantasy VII. I'm kinda curious what your personal history with Square is.
That's a good question, and I wanna start it off with saying that, like, for me, it really did start with Final Fantasy VII. To give context, when I first got, my PlayStation, I had mentioned before having a friend at the time who had a PlayStation, who had Resident Evil, who put me onto horror games through Resident Evil, and then, like, a little further down the line, I got a new friend, his name Matt, got Final Fantasy VII, and he was always into RPGs, another Chrono Trigger fan, and so I had no interest in Final Fantasy VII, didn't know anything about it, didn't really play RPGs like that. But he was like, "Hey, check this out." And the moment that game started, my brain exploded. And then at some point he was just like, "Hey, I beat the game, borrow it." And that was like my first real experience of a turn-based RPG like that, and I was hooked. From that moment forward, it didn't matter that it was a Square RPG, I just needed an RPGs. And, like, I'm gonna be honest, I went from Final Fantasy, and then I started anything that, like, had Square's logo on it, I was like, "I need to try it." So, and I don't have a good timeline, but, Final Fantasy Tactics, the day that that came out, I was on top of it. I'm trying to think. Like, I had a lot of Square games at the time, and I feel like for me, a lot of it goes more into PS2 times. But like, because of Square and because of Final Fantasy, that really got me into like my favorite franchise became the Wild Arms franchise.
I don't know, it's interesting because to me, because you had mentioned, like, not really being interested until, like, Matt got you into it, and a lot of the story goes, the popular history, as I sometimes call it, is that it was because Square put so many people onto Final Fantasy VII, such a big team for all the cinematics, and then just poured so much into the marketing, like, the first video game to have a trailer in a movie theater, which they played up in the marketing where they said, the biggest adventure is not coming to a theater near you. It's on your PlayStation was like the big tagline. And I think that money and marketing definitely go a long way to take what had been a very niche genre. But, going back to where I start with Square or really got my start with Square, we'll dive into that a little bit deeper. Like with the Super Nintendo, I feel like Square had been, like, very slowly building up this, like, very rabid fan base that kind of a meme of sorts. I wonder how much of it really was, like, Final Fantasy VII's gigantic marketing campaign and those graphics, and how much of it really just was, like, word of mouth, like, spreading as our generation got more and more of a disposable income. I wonder how much that plays a role, and I'm sure it's a mix of the 2, right?
Oh, I'm
But
sure.
I feel like a story like yours where a friend of yours who was already kind of big into RPGs, kind of pushing, Final Fantasy VII onto you, I bet that happened a lot. And honestly, there's some crossover with my story. It's just earlier.
You know what, Adrian, I
So
do wanna interrupt really quick,
sure.
'cause I just had to, for fun, pull up. I don't always have the best memory of time, but kind of pulling up a list of games and when they came out. Final Fantasy VII definitely opened my eyes to Squaresoft, and now looking back, I'm like, "Oh, yeah, that's right. If it wasn't for Final Fantasy VII, I wouldn't have checked out Bushido Blade. Bushido Blade was a huge game in my life. Like, it helped me, like, bridge gaps of friends. Like, that was a truly a huge game for me.
Yeah, one of the
Um,
Parasite Eve videos I watched brought up Bushido Blade for a while, and I was like, "Why are we talking about this?" In the middle of a Parasite Eve video, but, like, no, for sure, like, Bushido Blade was a big one for me. More Bushido Blade 2 than than Bushido Blade 1, but, Square was making all kinds of games at this period, not just RPGs, which is why the PlayStation era for them was so exciting. But go on, you weren't finished your thought.
no, 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 no. I
Yeah.
was just saying that, like, looking at that, Bushido Blade, it made me go back to a really good friend of ours, Chris, got me into Brave Fencer Musashi. Games like that I completely forgot about.
One of the very few games from that era of Square that I never played.
Yeah, no, there were so many, and then post Final Fantasy VII, of course, like I bought Final Fantasy VIII for my birthday with, like, birthday money. Square played a huge part in my gaming life.
Square was so big at this point. They were pouring money into anything, and almost anything that they released, like, sold and sold very well. I talk about Square, and I talk a lot about the PlayStation era just because of how different all the games are. I feel Parasite Eve falls into that category too, because, the big AAA releases. We talk about big AAA being very safe these days, and I think that sometimes that gets overstated, but there is a ring of truth to it, and Square is a great example because they are doing so many neat and different things during this period. So I think that that is a good thing to mention, and how so many people kinda just started buying anything that Square would release at this point because they were such a trusted name and such. It was not a secret to me that the game was a sequel to a novel. This had been mentioned in magazines I was reading at the time. Lamont, I imagine you had no idea when you first played Parasite Eve.
Absolutely not. And I'm gonna be completely straightforward. I didn't realize it until, like, you and I had a discussion about it in preparation for the podcast.
Really?
Yeah, I did
That
not know.
that one does surprise me. Simply because, like, I know that you and me have watched a lot of J-horror. Remember watching stuff like Dark Water at the apartment and such like that.
Oh, yeah.
I would have definitely figured that, like, the book got localized here in 2005. I don't remember when the film came out and got its, English release. I would have assumed that you would have just come across it pretty naturally, but
I would have figured that as well, and it was so
mhm.
funny, once again, getting ready for this podcast, where it didn't even occur to me that, like, A, you had told me, like, that you had read the book, and I was like, "Oh, awesome." And then I was like, "Oh, there's a movie that also came out in the '90s," and I'm like, "I was watching J-horror at the time. How did this escape me?"
Yeah, no, I honestly assumed that you knew, and again, I didn't assume that you would have known as early as I did, but I assumed that you would have just came across it, but that's interesting. So I read the book, Lamont, you watched the movie.
Yes.
What I'd like to do now is kinda just talk about the book, give a as brief as I can an overview of my experience and what happens in the book and such. I'd also talk a little bit about, like, the creator and the response to the book and such. And then I'm very curious to hear from you how this matches up with with what happens in the movie. And for those of you who are mostly here for the game, I do think that actually knowing about this book helps put the game into a lot of context, but we'll get there when we start talking about the game. So,
Well, and
really
I do wanna
yeah,
interrupt to say
sure.
I agree with that. Having originally not known that this was a sequel, having watched the movie and then experienced the game, there's so much value, like, there's, like, so many aha moments that, they give you it eventually in the game, but if you know the book and the movie, you get it off the bat. You're like, "Oh, I understand what's happening. I get this reference." It all makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, like, we'll get there when we get there, but I feel that, like, the game does do a pretty good job of bringing you in. There's a whole character that's their whole job in the book
Yep.
or in the video game, but yeah, we'll get there in a second. One real quick thing I wanna dive into is that, like, it's often considered very strange, that Square would license a book and do an RPG for it. And as Lamont kind of alluded to earlier, there's a lot of mystery to why that actually happens. I do want to point out really quickly, there is precedence for this because there is another novel that Square adapted and turned into an RPG. So Lamont, that's your pop quiz for the day. What do you know what book Square had previously adapted into an RPG?
No. No, I don't think I do.
I know, like, there's probably some people who listen to this who know what's coming, but, for Lamont, I think this is gonna blow your mind a little bit. For the NES, never came out to the United States, which is also kinda funny. There is a Square RPG for The Adventures of Tom Sawyer.
Oh, that's so weird.
It is very weird, and if you look up screenshots for it in a quick Google, I bet you will very quickly realize why that never came to the United
Oh,
States.
I'm on it right now.
I mean, you might get the idea just from the source material, but
I mean, yes, but let's see.
I am deliberately waiting for this reaction.
Oh, I see that art right now. Oh, ooh,
Yep,
boy.
yep. But, I don't know. I've never actually played this game, and I'm sure it has no bears no resemblance to Parasite Eve. Square's done this before. They did it many years prior to Parasite Eve, but they have done this before. So my understanding is that the book written by Hideaki Senna was extremely popular with its Japanese audience at the time. I have not dived into a lot of information. I don't know that there's a lot of information out there in the English speaking parts of the internet about what exactly about this book like spoke to Japan. Like there is definitely allusions to the controversial topic of organ transplants, which is a big factor of the book. I don't know how much of that played into the popularity or what the size of that controversy actually was in Japan. Regardless to say, this was a pretty popular book. And one of the things that makes the book unique is that Hideaki Senna is not a traditional novelist. They actually have a pharmacology background, which, it's through their scientific research that they came up with the plot and idea of this book. This kind of thing does happen every once in a while. The only other point of comparison that I have off the top of my head is the movie Primer, from a few years later. That was a time travel movie that was done by written by a couple of scientists.
I remember this movie.
Mhm.
I remember that it exists. I don't remember watching it, though.
It's a pretty good movie. I will say from my perspective, I think it's a better movie than Parasite Eve is a book, but we'll talk a little bit more after that. I do wanna kinda just get through the a quick rundown of what this book actually is and what it's about. So, the book starts with the internal thoughts of a woman by the name of Kiyomi, who it is her birthday, which is Christmas Eve. And I'm just realizing now that I completely blanked to mention that this is our Christmas episode. The game takes place during Christmas Eve, or at least it starts at Christmas Eve, and Christmas Eve is a major part of the story of this book. Kiyomi, it is Christmas Eve. It is also her birthday, and in her internal thoughts while she is driving, she feels something pulling her in one direction. When she regains consciousness, it's right before she gets into a car crash. And the results of that car crash is that she is officially declared brain dead. But she also was an organ donor. And the book makes it very clear very quickly that having organ transplants is still a sort of taboo topic in Japanese culture. People are concerned about the idea of harvesting one's body parts for the use of another. But her kidney is going to be transplanted into a teenage girl by the name of Mariko Anzai. And if you're here specifically to learn the connection between the game and the book, this is actually the most important character.
Yes.
I don't know that she's the most important character in the novel. Obviously, a very big important part to the plot, but for the game specifically, Mariko Anzai is the most important person here. And she is important because she is a teenage girl who had a bad kidney, has already gone through a transplant once before, and her body rejected the transplanted kidney. And after that moment, she kind of becomes depressed, doesn't really want to have another transplant, doesn't really wanna go through that trauma again, which is totally normal thing, but her dad thinks that this is what she wants and really pushes her, to get this new transplant because almost immediately, is when after this period, after she's recovered from the previous rejection, is when Kiyomi has her car accident, and now suddenly, there is a new kidney, but we have to go now. We have to make the decision, we have to go now. Um, at the same time, they are getting ready to do this transplant. Kiyomi's husband, a man by the name of Toshiaki, gets really depressed that his wife is dead, but then starts to come up with an idea that maybe he can kind of keep his wife alive through researching her mitochondria that exists within her liver. So he kind of makes a sketchy backdoor deal to get a piece of her liver, but from one of the doctors while during this transplant. And then what proceeds is probably the most infamous part of the novel, the thing that everyone brings up, and I'll bring it up here. A like very detailed description of the actual transplant. So, if you ever want to learn how to perform a kidney transplant, there are probably worse places to look than the novel Parasite Eve. The transplant, though, is actually very important, and it's specifically because of Kiyomi's DNA, or more specifically, her mitochondria. So, mitochondria, which here's a question for you, Lamont, kind of to give a little bit of a pace breaker in this long lore dump.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Um, what were you taught about mitochondria in school?
Oh, no. See, Adrian, I'm gonna make the joke because everyone's gonna make the joke that just like all the sleeper agents, the moment that you say it, you're gonna say that is the powerhouse of the cells.
Right.
So, that is always my immediate. Now, I do know, like, kind of the stuff that they talk about in this and how, like, mitochondria being, like, its own organism, like, having its own DNA, essentially being a parasite that powers humanity, like, I did know about that.
Yeah, symbiogenesis and that symbiotic relationship between mitochondria, which to be clear, the book is what posits that it is a parasite.
Yeah.
And that is like with the idea from Senna being what if this like kind of had a separate evolution and such. Um but yeah, this idea of them being a separate being, and I think the game specifically, if I'm remembering correctly, even alludes to it possibly being a cosmic horror. I might be misremembering that particular detail, but I believe that's a particular detail from the game. Um, these theories have been posited before. It really is Senna kind of bringing this idea in, and what if they fought back?
Yeah, and that the sci-fi aspect of it, like, that, certainly, but I definitely remember, like, at some point kind of getting into, I guess, the weeds of that kinda stuff at a, weird, younger, impressionable age.
I mean, I will say for my part, yeah, the mitochondria powers the cell. That's about as much as I got. Honestly, no like really detailed explanation there, which I gotta say, again, having not read the book when I first played the game very much in the spirit of the novel goes into a lot more detail on how these things work as just part of its general story. But we'll get there when we get there. So, um, Kiyomi's mitochondria, if we think of mitochondria as a separate being, has evolved beyond the mitochondria that you might typically see, um, in a human being. You'd almost like can think of it as a mutation, right? Um, to where it is sentient, it has its thoughts, and it has the ability to not just control its host, which in this case is Kiyomi, but also can control mitochondria in beings around it. So a lot of the characters in the novel are actually not acting of their own will, which you do not know immediately. It is Eve manipulating their mitochondria to make them act and behave in ways that they wouldn't. And this also is why Toshiaki takes the liver culture in the first place, because Eve is putting together this plan. Another trope that you see in a lot of media, but you see it a lot in Japanese stories, is this idea of the ultimate mastermind. And Eve just has this giant plan that involves all of these moving parts. And one of those is getting one Kiyomi into the accident so that her kidney gets transplanted into an organ donor. And even the idea of her becoming an organ donor at all
Oh, yeah.
was was Eve. But also for Toshiaki being influenced to want to take this liver culture so that Eve can grow as a separate being from the mitochondria that it gets transplanted into Mariko. So at this point, the novel kind of goes into a very, very slow burn where it takes a while for the plot to actually like kind of get going. A lot of intriguing things happening. But by the time like we actually get into like things becoming quote unquote exciting, the liver culture eventually grows into Kiyomi or a clone of Kiyomi. And even a clone isn't really the right terminology. It's not Kiyomi. I point this out because it's going to be important when we get to the game. It's not
Yes.
Kiyomi. It is Eve. Just taking Kiyomi's form, if anything, to kind of mess with Toshiaki. And the next part of the plan, this is where we start to get into some of the icky stuff, is that Eve can't survive on her own for very long. So she needs to essentially create a human mitochondrial hybrid to be able to both live forever and also control all of the mitochondria across all of humanity. So in order to do that, she needs human sperm. And to do that, she rapes Toshiaki in one of the weirdest segments of the book.
Okay, so I wanna interrupt really quick, Adrian, and say, so far, movie and book pretty much one to one until we get to that.
I could not imagine that scene working in a movie. Like even just the visuals, that the way that it is described in the book.
I am curious and mortified.
Yeah, I'll let you look up that section of the book yourself.
Sounds good.
So she gets Toshiaki's sperm, and then escapes through the sewer line, goes to the hospital where Mariko is recovering from her kidney transplant, which seems to be going good, except for Mariko like feeling weird vibrations and kind of hallucinations and weird things like that, because Eve goes to Mariko and impregnates her with Toshiaki's sperm in order to create what Eve calls the ultimate being, basically a hybrid human mitochondrial being that will have the ability to control all mitochondria, which again, all humans have mitochondria in them, all living beings have mitochondria in them. Where the plan ends up going awry, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in the middle, Toshiaki calling all the different hospitals, trying to find it. So basically, like the big chase sequence of the movie, or excuse me, the big chase sequence of the book, I guess we'll say. Um, the reason why it fails is sort of because mitochondria can be thought of, for some reason, the book posits that mitochondria can be thought of as female, hence Eve and Eve's form, and also the history that we think that mitochondria might have first been sown in a human female that is typically named mitochondrial Eve. Mitochondria is naturally female, but Toshiaki's sperm has male mitochondria, which then fights for control of Eve's female mitochondria, and it's because of that mix that Eve did not foresee when coming up with her with her master plan. The ultimate being is not able to essentially live because the two forms of mitochondria, male and female, are fighting within her body. This kind of reads a little ick to me. I don't know that it's intentional. I think that what's going on here is sort of the idea of yin and yang opposing but necessary forces. One sometimes being symbolized as female, the other being symbolized as male. Um, I think that you could get into some like really weird gender essentialist nonsense with this read, with a ultimate primarily female being trying to replace everything in the world with a version of herself, and is then taken down by by the opposing uh, male mitochondria. Um, I don't know that read is the intended read here. Doesn't make me feel very good, but that is ultimately what ends up happening to Eve. Koshiaki also dies as well because there's something with the fact that the kid is the ultimate being isn't able to live, is gonna like blow up into like a psychic nuke or something, but that's neither here nor there. So that's the book.
What?
To wrap, yeah, I know it's weird. This all kind of I will say the book has a great reputation in Japan. Since it was localized here, it does not have that great of a reputation in the United States. It's very dry. It gets into a lot of some might call unnecessary scientific detail. The plot doesn't really make sense unless you have that scientific detail, though. Ultimately, for me, I think the beginning is very intriguing. I think it's playing with some really interesting ideas. The middle portion of the book is sort of dull. When do we get to the fireworks factory? And then when we do get to the ending, it's kind of a very rushed action movie kind of feel, and everything kind of just devolves into weird Deus Machina. I mean, no one takes down Eve. Eve kind of takes down herself, and that's kind of an anticlimactic end to me. Uh, so I'm not going to say I didn't enjoy reading it, though. Like, it wasn't, like, necessarily, like, a book that I was forcing myself to get through. But at the end of the day, it's fine. That's kinda all I got for it. I would recommend a plot synopsis, maybe a better one than I gave, if you're curious, before playing Parasite Eve. I would not necessarily recommend the book. Now, Lamont, you already mentioned that there is one thing different. My understanding is that the movie is somewhat faithful, but does change the ending.
And that's what I was gonna say. For the ending, it's interesting because it still plays on this love story thing, where like Eve is in charge, is kind of in control of Kiyomi's body, but at some point, like Kiyomi takes back over, and
That's interesting, and that's interesting for things we'll get to when we talk about the game. That does not happen in the book.
yeah, so like she kind of takes back control because like she's walking away. She has everything that she needs. She's going to be giving birth to like the ultimate being. And Toshiaki is like he is on fire and like I forget what he says, but he says something and it like brings her forth. Eve loses control. They basically just have this moment of embrace and they're just burning together. They just burn out together, and it's sad, but also, like, beautiful. It's a very weird moment.
I like that well, I like that a lot better than just male mitochondria fighting female mitochondria inside the body,
Yeah, no, they
which
for the movie, they end it in a love story where it's 2 people who, even though, like, Eve, masterminded this and manipulated it and thought that, like, she was the one in control, he was like, "No, I was always in love with her from the moment that I saw her, you know, in her pink dress, like, she didn't even notice me, but I noticed her, and I loved her from that day." And, like Eve had no control. It had nothing to do with Eve. Eve didn't manipulate that. He had always loved her, and he mentions that, like, he mentions, like, the day that they met, the first time that he ever saw her, and, like, it becomes this true, like, love story of always loving her, and Eve had nothing to do with it. And I think that was the big thing. And like, it had nothing to do with male or female mitochondria. It was truly just, as silly as it sounds, a power of love moment.
you've already kind of alluded to the fact that, like, there really isn't a lot known about the actual development of Parasite Eve.
Yeah, no, I tried to find it. I really did.
If there are any game journalists listening to this, Hironobu Sakaguchi is right now doing the press rounds for Neo Fantasian. I think that, like, if anybody out there is listening to this, is anyone could, like, actually just ask Sakaguchi about the history of Parasite Eve or how this came to be, I think that would, like, be very useful and very helpful because there is a lot of stuff that can be inferred. There's a lot of speculation, and we're gonna talk about that speculation today, but there's no firm facts, and I think that, like, getting some firm facts from Sakaguchi would be very, very useful
Yeah, absolutely agreed
because
on that.
there are definitely things that you hear that kinda contradict each other, in the lead up to Parasite Eve's release. So, number 1, why do a sequel to this book? Outside of the fact that the book is very popular. I think that we can actually find part of an answer by looking back to our previous episode. Silent Hill became a thing because Konami saw the success Capcom had with Resident Evil. I don't think it's a big stretch to say that Square was doing the same thing here. Like Lamont, you already brought up that Square had made, fighting games at that during this period of time. One game that we never got here in the US was a drag racing RPG called Racing Lagoon.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
I heard about that one.
so the idea of Square being like looking at Capcom's success with Resident Evil and wanting to do an RPG take on survival horror, not a huge stretch. I would say that like part of this probably just comes down to let's make our own Resident Evil, but let's
Oh,
do
yeah.
it in a Square sort of way. Why license a book? I don't know. Resident Evil or excuse me, Silent Hill was going to be The Mist originally. So, and again, there's precedence from Tom Sawyer at least to a small degree. All we can really say is that the book was very popular.
Oh, yeah, and I mean, like, it was very popular. It was, like, I mean, a hit book. It was part of the J-horror phenomenon with, like, fictions like The Ring. So, I mean, and when you think about, like, The Ring and, the significance that both book and film have had in J-horror and in horror, period, at this point, it doesn't surprise me that they would use that. Granted, they could have used The Ring, but I couldn't
Uh,
imagine a game I couldn't imagine making a game based on that property.
well, I've never played The Ring for Sega Dreamcast, but I've heard it's not very good.
I didn't even know that was a thing.
We will cover it one day, and then we will both play The Ring for the Sega Dreamcast. Back to Parasite Eve, though, really quickly. I mean, also, just again, Final Fantasy VII played around with biohorror and genetics and mixed that in with a fantasy story. And Final Fantasy VII is also a game that was deeply important to Hironobu Sakaguchi, who during this period lost his mom to a car accident. Hey folks, Adrian here from the editing room again. Just wanted to issue a couple of quick corrections. Number one, the time frame. Hironobu Sakaguchi actually lost his mother somewhere closer into the Final Fantasy III development cycle, which would have been like the early 90s. It's Final Fantasy III for the NES/Famicom, not the Super Famicom Final Fantasy VI. Secondly, he lost his mother in a fire, which still to me seems relevant given the topic of Parasite Eve, but it was not a car accident. I do stand by my speculation that the loss of his mother and how that impacted his creative work may have had some influence on the decision to go with Parasite Eve for their survival horror slash RPG hybrid game. I stand by that speculation, but I did get some of the details wrong here and just wanted to issue that retraction. So, on with the episode. And I have to imagine, and again, this is speculation on my part, I have to imagine that Sakaguchi, like a lot of people in Japan, read Parasite Eve, had lost someone close to him, like what happens in the book. I have to imagine that there was something of a personal take here.
Oh, yeah.
And we will get into it, but I think that there are similarities, if not in the actual plot details, but the themes that are explored in Parasite Eve the novel, Parasite Eve the game, as well as Final Fantasy VII, and also Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, all works that were by Sakaguchi's mother in some way.
Oh, see, I'm glad that you brought that up because I didn't even catch that. Like, I do know the Final Fantasy VII connections, with Parasite Eve. But I didn't know about those personal details that you're talking about. So that's I think even more fascinating.
One mystery that I do want to address that I don't think there's a clear answer to, and I've seen contradictory statements on, is why set the sequel in New York City?
Well, and that's one of those things that, like, as you said, I don't have clear stuff on that either. But the things that I did read kind of said that, like, even in the early development of 7, Sakaguchi wanted to do a game set in New York City.
Right. So, supposedly the story goes that Sakaguchi had been wanting to do a detective game in New York City as early as like the early 90s, prior to Final Fantasy VI even. Been something that he'd wanted to do for a long time. At one point, Final Fantasy VII was in development where you played a detective named Hot Blooded Joe in New York City investigating something. And so, yes, possibly, Final Fantasy VII eventually got a different story altogether, taking place in a fantasy setting that definitely a little bit more of a modern look to it than previous Final Fantasy games, but still in a fantasy setting. And so that setting was then used for Parasite Eve. Where I think it gets murky is that Harunobu Sakaguchi had always been the producer of this game, not the director, the producer. We'll talk about the director in a second. When the game started development, it was going to take place in Tokyo.
Yes, I did hear that as
Started
well.
development in Tokyo, and then at some point changed its location to New York. So it is possible that Sakaguchi had that influence. I would think that if, this idea that was originally going to be a Final Fantasy game had then translated into Parasite Eve, I would think then that Parasite Eve was always planned for New York City, rather than just having started development as taking place in Tokyo and then get turned into New York. So to me, this is all still speculation. I've never
Yeah.
even really seen a lot of proof that Final Fantasy VII was going to take place in New York at one time. I really do not know where the primary sources are for any of this information. So again, until someone like just goes to Hironobu Sakaguchi and asks, "Hey, did you always want to make a detective game in New York City? Was that Final Fantasy at one point? And did Parasite Eve become that game?" Until like someone just asks Sakaguchi directly and we get some direct answers, which number one, it's the video game industry, and number two, it's the Japanese video game industry. We probably wouldn't give us straight answers to. But until we hear it right from him, I don't know that we'll ever clearly know if any of this is true.
Yeah.
What I do know is true is that Sakaguchi only produced this game, so clearly had a lot of influence. I say Ayabri, I've heard it pronounced Ayabrea. I don't know which is the actual pronunciation.
I don't know
Um,
either.
I'm gonna keep saying Brie, and everyone it's gonna mess with a lot of people, and I don't care. Um,
Here's what I'm gonna do.
yep.
I am going to, after this, play both 2 and Third Birthday and see if there's any voice lines that
Oh,
just say
that's
her name.
it's funny, I have played Third Birthday, and I don't remember if there's voice acting and and how they pronounce it, but I'm still gonna say Brie in this podcast, and no one can stop me. I love Tetsuya Nomura's character design for Aya, though, and I think that it absolutely stands out. I think that was the right direction to go.
Same, and he didn't go crazy with zippers or anything.
But I do wanna talk about the actual director of this game. Probably my favorite Square person, Takashi Tokida. Takashi Tokida was the lead designer for Final Fantasy IV, director of Chrono Trigger, the director of Live Alive, also the director and writer of this game. Super, super influential person. I mean, he is basically the reason why Final Fantasy is what it is today. And it's because he is so I was gonna say narrative focused, but it goes beyond just narrative. Square had been dabbling in Final Fantasy, specifically Final Fantasy II on the NES with doing what I would call puppet theater, making their sprites act like actors on a stage and do it and kind of doing very theatrical stuff. But Takashi Tokida actually has a theater background. And in writing and designing Final Fantasy IV, a story that focuses very much on personal tragedy, it's also a love story. It goes through all of these very epic things that I think Final Fantasy is going to get very well known for over time. I really credit Takashi Tokida for essentially creating the direction that all Square games will follow coming off of Final Fantasy IV. He is very, very theater minded. I actually did an entire talk on the connection between video game storytelling and theater storytelling, and that I did for my work with the Philadelphia IGDA. That talk did a little bit of rounds on the internet. I'll share it in the show notes for this talk. But Tokida features a lot in that little 5-minute essay that I did. Probably one of my biggest inspirations, honestly, in terms of how to tell a story in a video game. And I think putting him on Parasite Eve is fascinating for a couple of reasons. The biggest being that really this game does have cinematic ambitions beyond even what they're doing with Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII is cinematic in that it has, it's Square experimenting with telling stories through FMV, through pre-rendered CG graphics, and integrating that into gameplay in the best way that it can. But for the most part, with its squat little characters and whatnot, it is essentially a 3D Final Fantasy. It is Parasite Eve that is doing pre-rendered backgrounds in the same way that Resident Evil does. It is in the framing of each individual shot. It is in all those aspects that I think that Tokida is actually getting to stretch muscles that I don't think he has stretched in previous games that he's directed. But he is always, always, always thinking about how to present the narrative in very visual ways and in the language of specifically video games. I mean, I mentioned that prior to Parasite Eve, he did Live Alive. Live Alive is essentially how do you do a short story anthology in the form of a video game? And here it very much feels like, okay, Resident Evil is a thing with it, and is doing a lot of really cool cinematic stuff. How do we do that in a way that still feels very Squaresoft? So I feel like Tokida's influence is felt through Parasite Eve in that it obviously is cribbing from Resident Evil in its presentation, but as a game that I think like is popular specifically because of its vibe, its aesthetic, the feel of the game, and its presentation. I think that Tokida deserves a lot of credit for that. Obviously, I'm giving a lot of credit to one person in a game that had a pretty large international team, and obviously everybody on that team deserves that credit. But Takashi Tokida was absolutely the director to bring all those people together to create what I think is, for a company that was making very innovative, very unique games during this time period, one of their most unique and interesting games, even as a Resident Evil Final Fantasy fusion.
No, I think you bring a great point, and, like, talking about direction, I kinda wanna veer really quick and just mention that, like, looking at this game, now in the year of 2024, it holds up. It is a beautiful game, like, when we talk about art direction, and, like, I love that it is New York City, but there's still fantasy to it. Like, when you go into the sewers, that is not a New York City sewer, but man, did
No.
that make me wanna go to the New York City sewers and see whatever kind of crazy gothic architecture is going on down there.
And so I was going to ask this a little bit later on, but I'll ask it now because we're talking about it now, which is just the look and feel and vibe of this game. I love you bringing up the sewers in particular. I had meant to ask prior to this podcast, Chris Totten to weigh in on some of the screenshots and some of the architecture and such in the game because he has the architecture background, I don't. So I can't like speak to like the specific kind of architecture that they're pulling from here. What I will say is that this game feels very late 90s in the best way possible.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
this reminds me so much of like the really maximalist, like, set designs that you would see in film during this period, and Square is just going the artists are just going all out with these
Oh,
pre-rendered
man.
backgrounds to create, like, kind of this fantasy vibe, but a very, like, urban fantasy, a very late '90s sort of fantasy. Um, I'm gonna try and leave some examples in the show notes so you can see, like, the sewers and whatnot and how they do this, and even, like, I've never been to a museum in New York City. I don't think that the Art Museum of Natural History actually looks like what it looks like in this game, but again, just kind of just like playing with some just very evocative set design.
You know, Adrian, you said something and it just did it made my brain light up. This is like that time period where think about The Crow and how they had this weird dark fantasy version of Detroit. And it's, that is not real Detroit, but for some weird reason in our heads, we were like, this is like whatever dark fantasy we had going on of a normal modern city. That's what they did with New York. They just kind of ran with it. And it only just hit me thinking about that movie because I watched the new one not too long ago and it made me do a deep dive of the original and the model that they used for the city and how they did certain camera angles and that just really punched me in the face.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I haven't seen The Crow in a long time, but I could absolutely see where you're coming from here. And I don't know if The Crow was a specific influence on Parasite Eve's look and feel, but I think that if you want to like look at something that, is kind of playing with the same kind of aesthetic that Parasite Eve is looking at, The Crow would be not a bad one to look at. Now, I want to move on to the other film. I wonder if had also had inspiration to Parasite Eve. Lamont, you brought up the sewers in particular and like their sort of gothic architecture. And thinking about how the sewers are a prominent part of this game, but also the art museum and some of the things that happen a little bit later on in the plot, I wonder how much Ghostbusters 2 was an
Oh my
influence on
god.
Parasite Eve.
Thank you. The moment okay, I need to say the moment that we are in New York City and the goo on the Statue of Liberty, I was just like, "Wait a minute, guys. What is happening here?"
Well, I'm even just thinking about the goo descending upon the art museum,
Oh, that too.
which, it doesn't, like, completely encase it like the slime in Ghostbusters 2, and let's be clear, like, the slime stuff in Parasite Eve is designed and looks a lot like what it does in the movie. But also, I think that number 1, like, it's not a huge stretch that, like, when looking for the aesthetics of New York, that they wouldn't just look at New York movies, and what more quintessential New York movie is there than Ghostbusters 1 and 2?
Oh,
But
yeah.
the fact that, like, a museum plays a gigantic role as a giant centerpiece in Ghostbusters 2, the way that the slime focuses and centers around that museum. Now, the sewers in and there is sort of a fantasy style sewer in Ghostbusters 2 as well, does not look like the sewers in Parasite Eve, and also has the historical background of it being not the current New York City sewers, but the ones that were shut down as the modern sub when the modern subways were built. But still, like, there's just too much here to be a coincidence, right? Like,
Yeah.
so we're saying it here, like, this again, speculation, but I feel pretty confident Ghostbusters 2, a huge influence on Parasite Eve. Do with that what you will. We've talked around Parasite Eve. Let's actually talk about what this game is. New York City police detective Aya Bree is going to the opera with a date who we never get their name. All that we know that's important at this point is that it was Aya's decision to go to the opera. It seems out of character for her, at least that's what we are told, but there was something that compelled her to go there. And then nothing bad happens whatsoever.
Nothing at all.
It's a nice time at the opera. What I will say is that this is where I think things get very interesting because what I got to do, now having read the book, was actually play this game from the perspective of someone who had previously read the book, which was a brand new experience. It really does refresh Parasite Eve for me because you have to think that for the Japanese audience, that's the experience that they got, that they were playing this game because it was the sequel to a very popular novel. And I actually think that that puts the theater sequence in a completely new light.
Yes, I completely agree. Like, and that's what I was saying earlier is that, both of us, we played this game without that prior knowledge. And that was such a cool scene. When I got to experience that this time around, it was still cool, but there's something chilling about it, like really understanding what was happening.
Right, because, like, in the book, it is made known that Eve can light people on fire. Like, the mitochondria as a powerhouse does have the ability to heat up and produce electrical energy, essentially allows Eve to make people combust. But in the book, it happens fairly rarely, and it's always at, like, Eve's, like, command. It's not just like Eve's presence does it, which is sort of they kind of play that it could be her presence, it could be a thing that, like, she turns on and off, but it always happens in mass numbers. It happens to a wide area. And so, like, even if you kinda understand what's happening as someone who's read the book, the scale of it is much bigger than anything that happens in the book. And so already at the top of the game, we have raised the stakes from where we are in the novel. And we're also given an immediate mystery, which is that Aya doesn't burn, and also her date. But I guess we'll ignore that. I mean, not everybody burns immediately, but like
Yeah.
there are people seen running out of the theater and such. But
Oh, you're right, but they also it's very funny. I mean, I guess the biggest thing is that Aya survived and stayed, but they make it known like she is supposed to be the only survivor. That was the whole big deal was that she was the only survivor, the only one who didn't catch on fire. But he definitely made it out.
yeah, like, and that might be a mistranslation thing. We'll talk about the localization of this game a little bit later on, but suffice it to say, much like Final Fantasy VII and the localization in Square games during this era was weird, and Parasite Eve is a very strange localization. So yeah, everyone, but like most people inside the building definitely died, except for Aya. And is able to get up to Eve, or as we know her at this point, Melissa, the actress, and pretty early on, if you're doing the Resident Evil thing of looking in every room and checking documentation and such, we get the backstory for Melissa, who has seemingly turned into Eve, which is that she's a sickly woman. She's had some kind of operation or is on some kind of medication, worried about being replaced, but then suddenly the main actress gets hurt and is unable to perform, and Melissa goes on in her place as her understudy. And again, if you've read the book, you probably understand that like Eve probably has something to do with this because Eve can control people in that way. And Melissa very much is worried that like kind of has a guilty conscience about this, but this is her chance and is very excited to get on stage. And well, the results we see what ends up happening. But this does mean that we are already off course from a lot of what happens in the book. Eve takes over Melissa via transplant. We that's pretty established pretty early on. Eve before was just someone that existed within Kiyomi. So we have the mystery of how did Eve get into Melissa rather than just being a part of her the entire time. Again, why is Aya immune? And also there's a little girl that Aya is following around and is essentially helping the player be able to know where to go to next. Who is that person? Yeah, I imagine a lot of these mysteries were much more intriguing if you were a Japanese player who got to read the book.
Oh, yeah. But when it comes to Melissa and the other person's name was Suzanne, Melissa and Suzanne and like this role, that was a big thing. Was like there was a big thing for guilt for Melissa because Suzanne dies. She dies in a house fire.
Right. I couldn't remember if she actually died or not. I just knew that she couldn't perform.
Yeah, no, no. Like they established the fact that like they both have this role, and Melissa's afraid that because she's sick, she's not going to be able to hold on to it. And suddenly, Suzanne's house catches on fire and she dies. So now it's only Melissa.
Not do like a super big in-depth synopsis. We are introduced very quickly after the theater incident to Daniel, which is Aya's partner. We get an idea of his personality immediately because he punches a proper paparazzi who accosts Aya as soon as she gets out of the theater. So we kind of understand who Daniel is very, very quickly. But it's also important to understand Daniel because shortly after this, we move to the second day where we're introduced to Daniel's son and learn that his son and his ex-wife are going to go to Central Park where a concert is being performed or was scheduled to be performed by Melissa, and for some reason that concert has not been canceled.
Right?
And so now we have to get to Central Park to stop a second event from happening. And this leads us to another big change from the book, which is rather than everyone turning to fire from watching Eve's performance, everyone gets turned into goo. And this goo looks a lot like the goo from the movie. And it immediately goes into the sewer, and everyone's like, what happened to the people at Central Park? Now they're goo. And one thing I forgot to mention on top of all this is that also any animal in the vicinity is mutating into what can only be described as horrific mutations. Again, we already mentioned the rat that you fight at the very beginning that goes through a crazy body horror sequence with their jaw ripping in half and their nose elongating and skin tearing as they grow. It's a very gruesome sequence. I will say that like I don't think any of this really gets a proper explanation. I'm pretty sure that most of the monster transformations are just there to give you something to fight.
I agree. I mean, we could infer that like Eve forcing evolution of the mitochondria, and I don't know why it's animals specifically.
Yeah, and at this point, I feel like we are kind of going off the rails with the science a little bit. It's kind of got a little bit of Resident Evil T virus does whatever the virus wants it to do, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And shortly after the Central Park incident is when we get introduced to Maeda, the other major hero NPC, if you will, who is not from the book. I will say that I had remember reading at some point that like Maeda was the one character from the book. He's not, but he is essentially the character who is there to number one bridge the cultural gap between Japan and the US in the game, as well as kind of be the recap character. And at this point, we're mostly just recapping sequences that happen in the book, which is a sort of necessary, but also one of the worst horror sequel tropes that you see in a lot of movies, and in this case, a video game, which is that, we can't guarantee that you've read the book, and we can't guarantee that you've seen the original movie, so we have to, like, recap everything. Lamont, I'm sure you are familiar with this, but, particularly
Oh,
because a
yeah.
lot of horror movies are also mystery movies. Like, why is this happening? And it's a lot about the character kinda, like, discovering why it's happening, and then they get a lore dump at one point. And inevitably in the sequel, you have to get that lore dump a second time.
Yep, and I will say that, like, I had feelings on the lore dump for this one. It wasn't necessary. Like, it didn't help for me. Having watched the movie and then gone into the game, and then, like, experiencing the lore dump, I was like, "Alright, well, this is cool to know," but it didn't feel like it added enough, like, it didn't give me anything.
Probably assumes you've read the book.
Yeah, and, like, Maeda he was a fine addition. I think that if I think they probably would have been better to, like, bring over the doctor, from the book and from the movie, like, to bring over the doctor who did the transplant.
Yeah, possibly. And, like, they kinda play with the idea that, like, Maeda is sorta Aya's age, and they kinda set him up to kinda be a sort maybe not love interest is the wrong word, because there's no real indication that Aya, like, has any sort of feelings there, but clearly Maeda does.
Oh, yeah.
Um, that being said, I think it kinda gets into one of the things I wanted to bring up with the story element of this game, which is that you don't really get to know any of these characters very well outside Daniel probably the most, right?
Yeah.
And even Daniel's is very, like, old cop stereotype. Let's be honest, it's Lethal Weapon.
Mhm.
No character really gets a lot of depth here. They do start like, once we start to get towards the end and revelations start coming out about, like, what's actually going on, you get a little bit of Aya's background and such, but, again, I feel like this game's legacy and why it spoke to so many people is really vibes. And
Yeah.
we've talked about vibes before. It's a shorthand that I like a lot, but I think it is very apt to this game, that this game's, soundtrack from Yoko Shimomura has this very kind of, like, again, not the not the most musically minded over here, but, like, synth horror kind of, like, background noise kind of vibe to it that feels very good. All the backgrounds and set design, as we've already talked about, are, lend to the vibe, and also Aya as a character, I don't know, it's a simple design with the white t-shirt, the jacket, and the jeans, but it works. Like, I think Aya, in particular, like, always been one of my favorite characters, and someone who I love, but going back to this game, I, recognize she's honestly kinda thin as a character, at least in this first game.
Yeah, no, and it's funny because I agree, like, really looking at all of the characters, Daniel is the most fleshed out because, like, you have his relationship with his son, his wife, the chief, his background as a cop. You really learn a lot about him and, like, his fear of people. And, like, Aya is a part of that, and, like, that's where you get a lot of her personality is through him and his relationship and how he speaks of her.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. Like, there are multiple scenes where Aya drives with Daniel, and Daniel does talk about, her needing to step up a little bit more and such, which does end up playing a role into the finale, which we'll talk about in just a second. Before that, though, I think it's worth talking about how you actually play this game. So let's do that for a little bit.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So as we mentioned, it is a sort of combination survival horror and RPG in the Final Fantasy mold. I think actually what I said earlier about like the overall plot outside of just kind of recapping stuff that happens in the movie is fairly thin. There's not really a lot to this game's battle system and how it works, especially compared to stuff like, Final Fantasy. I actually think that works in Parasite Eve's favor, though. I think
Agreed.
this is a very easy game to play. It's very breezy, and I think it absolutely would work as someone's introduction to RPGs. So essentially, the way that it works is, can you call them random battles?
Yes.
I guess you can, because although they happen at set points, which is basically like when you first walk into a screen, which again works just like Resident Evil. You go from one screen to the other, it changes to a prefixed camera angle because everything is pre-rendered. But like you take a few steps into that scene, there's basically a coin flip. Are you going to get into a battle or not? So I guess that makes it a random battle. It's not a random battle the way that you would think of it in Final Fantasy, where a dice is rolled every time you take a step. You walk into a scene, are you going to battle on this screen or are you not? And more often than not, you are going to do a battle. If there is anything that can be said about where this game kind of falters, it really is just that like some of the later dungeons are a little bit more labyrinthy.
Oh
And I
gosh, yes.
and outside of, the post game, which we'll talk about, I'm mostly referring to the museum. The museum is very easy to get lost, and once you get lost somewhere, you're gonna be entering and exiting rooms a lot, which means you're gonna get into battles a lot. Outside of the post game, grinding isn't hugely necessary, so it's not even necessary that you get lost and grind a bit. That's probably the worst I can say about the overall game, is that sometimes you get a little lost, and that also equals up to a lot of battles.
So there's the first sewer that you run into, and that isn't so bad. There's that secondary sewer as well.
Right, where they actually, like, use a lot of the same images over and over again, which makes it really easy. You have to actually, like, old school style, bust out some graph paper and kinda draw what you're doing.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, and it doesn't last for very long, but it's still very annoying. Um, the actual battles themselves are very easy and they don't take a lot of time. That does mean they can get repetitive when you do end up in one of those streaks where you're just doing battle after battle after battle. But actually doing a battle is pretty fun and pretty quick. So the idea is that Aya is on a timer in the same way that a active time battle in a Final Fantasy works. Aya can't make a command until her timer reaches the end, at which point you can choose to shoot something, or you can go into the menu and use an item, or cast a mitochondria spell. Basically, Aya's form of magic in this game. One of the interesting things is that it's also an action RPG in that although the battles are turn-based, quote unquote, in the same way that a Final Fantasy is turn-based, Maya is actually able to run around the map. And running around the map is important because when enemies get to take their turn, and I imagine that they also have a timer bar that you can't see, which again, very Final Fantasy, they usually shoot if you're farther away from them, they shoot out a projectile. And those projectiles are very much in the arcade shooter format. Like the mouse, for example, will shoot out 3 fireballs with 2 going in diagonal and the other one's going straight, and your job is to essentially don't get hit by the fireball. So rather than, a dice roll, do they hit or miss, it's more about your ability to get out of the way. I think one thing that would make the game a little bit better is if there was some kind of dodge roll capability,
Oh, yeah.
for some of the later fights, but for the most part, it's mostly about getting out of the way. Now, if you're close to them, they will do a melee attack, so it's about kind of judging, do I wanna be close in to do damage? Do I want to stay further away so I have a chance to dodge an attack? The players get that sort of choice. When you go to do an attack, assuming you're not using the one melee weapon, which is the police club, with guns, depending on the gun's range stat, you get the game pauses and gives you a big grid. If your gun has the capability, it will determine how many bullets you can fire in one turn. There are different types of guns like in Resident Evil that have different bullet capacities, that have where you can shoot multiple bullets at a time. There are rapid fire machine guns and such. If a enemy is outside of that range space, you will do a lot less damage if you hit at all. But if they're inside the green, you're probably going to hit. You're probably going to do the full amount of damage, if not a little bit of critical damage. And that's essentially it. There is limited ammo in the Resident Evil mold, but by the time you get to, like, Central Park, ammo will never be an issue.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
basically, at the beginning of the game, ammo will never be an issue. So, it's kinda hard, honestly, to classify this as a "survival horror," quote, unquote, other than the fact that it's obviously aping from Resident Evil. Again, you can cast magic, and I think this is an important point too, is that magic is not on a point system, like a magic point system like you might see in the earlier Final Fantasy games. It is, sort of stamina based. So certain spells take up more of your bar than others. If you use one of the 2 offensive spells, there's only 2 offensive spells in the entire game. They take up your entire bar. The more full your bar is, the more damage that they do, and then Aya also gets a little bit stunned, so she can't move when you cast those 2 spells. But for the most part, most spells just take a chunk of the bar, and then it takes a little bit of time for it to fill up. And you can either decide to just use everything until it's empty, you can just use one spell and wait for it to fill. Most of the spells you're not going to use. I basically only ever use the offensive spells and healing when I played the game. Very occasionally, I might use one to heal like a status effect. There's only like 2 status effects in the game. 3,
Haste is a
actually.
good one to use.
Yeah. Haste can be helpful. I didn't really use it, honestly, and I didn't really feel like I needed to use it most of the time. But I think it's interesting that the meter charges up. And actually, I think there's a lot here to dissect with this battle system in terms of game history and Square history in particular. In terms of just Parasite Eve, though, it's pretty quick, it's pretty breezy, it's really interesting. Friend of the show, correspondent, former guest host, Steve Tramer posited to me on Blue Sky that he feels that Vagrant Story was the evolution of this system, that Vagrant Story might have, like, been built on top of Parasite Eve. I think that's absolutely possible. I didn't replay any of Vagrant Story before this podcast, I meant to.
I'm glad that you brought that up because I also decided to look that up because I was like, "Wait a minute, I know this battle system," and I was like, "This is Vagrant Story."
Yeah, no, Vagrant Story does have some similarities to it. My understanding is that Parasite Eve was built on top of Final Fantasy VII's engine.
Correct. That's what I had read as well. So Vagrant Story would have to, and I was trying to look up Vagrant Story to see if it was also, but it was later in development. That Vagrant Story was around the 2000s, and
Right.
it was its own thing. So definitely, I would say an evolution of that system, but not the same, not the same core system.
Right, yeah, that would make sense. I mean, here's the thing. So you start with Final Fantasy IV. Final Fantasy IV is the first one to use the active time battle system. They don't show the bars even for the player characters, but it's the first one to use this idea of rather than your turn being based off of a speed stat or initiative in D&D, having some sort of way to kinda make the game feel more like an action game despite being turn-based. That is really what Square starts to experiment with, starting with Final Fantasy IV. And they use the active time battle system basically all the way up until Final Fantasy X, with some slight variations. I think the next game to look at to get the Parasite Eve is actually Chrono Trigger.
Oh yeah.
That Chrono Trigger uses what they call active time battle 2.0. And the only thing that really makes 2.0 different from 1.0 is that, unlike Final Fantasy, but similar to Parasite Eve, the battles take place on the map directly rather than going to a separate battle screen. Unlike Parasite Eve, you actually do see the enemies in Chrono Trigger and such. You can't avoid most battles. People like to bring that up as like an advantage that Chrono Trigger has. You actually can't avoid most of the battles in Chrono Trigger, but they always happen in the same place and they always take place on the actual screen that you're on. And positioning is important, quote unquote, in Chrono Trigger. You might have noticed that I'm kind of, you can't see it, but I'm doing air quotes. I was doing air quotes with my voice,
I heard it.
right?
I heard it.
For the most part, enemies will wander around the screen a little bit, but you can't avoid them. Your characters are where they are, and they always go back to where they are. So there's like outside of just like picking the right spell for the right instance when enemies like move around and such, because spells have area of effect. The actual positioning aspect of Chrono Trigger isn't really a large part of the game. I would posit that Parasite Eve is the next step in that evolution of their battle systems. Parasite Eve, honestly, to me, the connection really does is closer to Chrono Trigger, where you have enemy position being important, you have the character's position being important, and you can actually like move around. And they're using a lot of arcade shooter language for that, with like how the enemies attack and how you avoid them and things. But you can see a direct line from what they're playing with and starting to do with Chrono Trigger and Parasite Eve.
I see that for sure.
Now, as we mentioned before, there is sort of a connection to the Vagrant story as well here. What I think is interesting is you think about how Parasite Eve is sort of an action RPG. It's a turn-based action RPG, but it's an action RPG where you can move around the map. When the active time battle does come up, you are given a menu that you can use, and your magic isn't necessarily based on MP. This is a lot closer to where Final Fantasy is going to go in like 10, 15 years
Oh,
from
that's
Parasite Eve.
weird.
Like Parasite Eve, we talk about Parasite Eve being like feeling very modern. I think it feels modern because this was the future for RPGs, just no one realized it yet.
Oh, that's crazy.
I haven't done a lot of research into this. My understanding is that, because obviously this is like Kingdom Hearts is going to be the first like big step on this evolution, right? Kingdom Hearts with its menu-based real-time action RPG. There's no turn-based in Kingdom Hearts, but it does have menus like Final Fantasy. Clearly that's an important step in the evolution. But what really gets you to Final Fantasy 16 and Final Fantasy 7 Remake and Rebirth, my understanding is The Witcher 3, that The Witcher 3 was very popular in Japan. And this happens. You don't get Japanese RPGs at all without the American RPGs Ultima and Wizardry and
Oh,
everything that
yeah.
came before Ultima and Wizardry. So Witcher 3 is like that big Western influence on the next stage of Japan. And I do think that you feel The Witcher 3's battle system in Final Fantasy 16, absolutely. A little bit less so Final Fantasy 7 Remake, but it's there. But years before any of this, Parasite Eve is basically doing the same thing.
Look at you, Parasite Eve.
Yeah, I don't know. I find that to be absolutely fascinating. Now, I do think that the simplicity of its battle system is also sort of a double-edged sword. I don't think that is nearly as interesting as some of the combat scenarios that are in 7 Remake and even the little bit of Final Fantasy 16 that I've played. And sometimes it does feel a little bit samey, more of a problem in the post game, but we'll get there soon. But there absolutely is something to how the Parasite Eve battle system is going to be Square's future and is going to be the future of RPGs. Just no one's realized it yet. So one quick thing that I skipped over when we were talking about the beats of the basic Parasite Eve plot is the character of Dr. Clamp. Dr.
Oh,
Clamp
yeah.
is a scientist currently working at the New York City Natural History Museum who gives you a lot of the background on mitochondria, what they are, the theory to how Eve is able to do the things that she's able to do prior to Maeda jumping into the plot and giving us the background on what happened in the previous story. Dr. Clamp turns out to be a really important character in this narrative for a couple of reasons. The biggest being one, he's the reason why Eve is able to carry forth her plot at all. So the way that they skirt around the more gross parts of the novel is that, again, the reason why Eve's plot didn't work out before was because of the sperm that she had collected. So Dr. Clamp engineers special sperm for Eve that will not rebel against her, so that she can create the ultimate being similar to how she created the ultimate being in the original novel. That's number 1. That also gets you to probably the most like Resident Evil dungeon of Parasite Eve, which is the hospital. I bring it up just because like it's funny that we talk about how Parasite Eve is a Resident Evil fusion, but like that actually comes in very rarely in this game beyond just the general look and the fact that you shoot things. But this is the one dungeon where you have to like solve puzzles, find keys, and kind of like, figure out the puzzle box of the dungeon. I wish they had did that a little bit more, but even what's in the hospital isn't all that great. But the big purpose of the hospital is that this is where Clamp is keeping the special sperm that Eve is going to be able to use to have an ultimate being that is not going to be rejected by the male mitochondria. This is why I was saying earlier, Lamont, like I want to say that the game is more of a sequel to the film based off of stuff that happens a little bit later, but it's this specific detail where it has to be a sequel to the novel. Mhm.
They probably used both.
Oh, there are definitely elements here. I mean, again, like the way that they do the slime, the Central Park goo, um,
Yeah.
is very much the same look as the movie. So that's the first thing that Dr. Clamp does, and that does eventually lead to a fight at New York City with some of the most interesting visuals in the game that I want to talk a little bit more about when we're wrapping this up, such as the when you fight Eve at the collapsed Statue of Liberty for that final fight against Eve, I think is a very interesting set piece for reasons we'll talk about. And eventually fighting the ultimate being itself on a battleship from the United States government, who again, just like they always do in these Japanese games, just always want to nuke everything. We're going to nuke New York City initially until Aya steps in and steps up her big moment of stepping up the one person who can take the fight to Eve because she has the ability. It is during this point that we start to learn why exactly Aya is able to do this. So, Aya had a twin sister, Maya, and their mother was Mariko Anzai, the girl who had the liver transplant of Kiyomi, and thus was going to be the mother of the ultimate being before. So, despite the fact that the kidney was never a good fit, it was really Eve that was making the basically forcing Mariko's body to be able to accept the kidney that the body ultimately wanted to reject.
Mhm.
Eve's mitochondria is within Mariko and therefore gets passed down to Maya. Well, it would have to be because they are twins. It got passed to both Maya and Aya. But
Um,
the way that well, again, we're playing pretty fast and loose with some science here, right?
yeah.
Like, Maya and Aya are identical twins. They're not fraternal twins, which means that they should share the same DNA.
Yes.
And if that were the case, they would both share Eve's mitochondria. That being said, the way that it is explained in the game is that Eve causes Mariko to get into a car crash, this time with Maya in the car, also again listed themselves as organ donors. Mariko's kidney goes to Melissa, the opera singer, when she's a little girl, and Maya's eye goes to Aya, who had degenerative eye condition when she was born.
Yes, that's right. That's what I call it. Yep.
So again, supposedly the idea here is that Aya's mitochondria is the way that it is and has protection against Eve because of that eye transplant. But as identical twins, I would posit that Amaya's DNA would have been there to begin with. But also, maybe this is important to the other thing, which is that Aya's mitochondria has evolved further beyond Eve's to want to protect its host, therefore protecting humanity. So you have these diametrically opposed mitochondrias at war with each other. One that wants to free the mitochondria, liberate it, and become the only, the survival of the fittest, become the only species out there and to supplant humanity versus the one that wants to actually protect its host and protect humanity. How that actually works when it should all be Eve's mitochondria?
Here's my thought, because I do have a thought on that. This comes from a Kingdom Hearts fan, so you're gonna get a Kingdom Hearts answer.
Well, I also think that I can think of thematic reasons why they would do this. I just can't think of like a plot reason why it makes sense.
The plot reason why I think it makes sense is just as you said. You have Mariko's kidney, which went to Melissa, which is the original Eve mitochondria. You have Maya, who is essentially the ultimate being. Like she is born of the uterus of the ultimate being. So there is that you have to factor in, and how like you have the kidney from the original Eve, and then you have an offspring in Maya. So the offspring would end up being an evolution, because that would be
Mhm.
the usual take, is that we pass on DNA and it evolves, yada yada, evolution. So you have
I can already hear Karen, my partner, who is uh definitely more versed in the science of these kinds of things than I am. I can already hear her cringing from that idea of like, things evolve through birth or something like that. But go on.
oh no, no, but like, that's usually when you think about the sci-fi tropes, like
Right,
that's
it's a story, right, exactly.
yeah. So if we go off of sci-fi tropes and all of that kind of stuff, and and as I said, Kingdom Hearts logic, that's where I would fall. Is that you have the old versus the new. Um, you have Eve's original mitochondrial DNA coming out of Mariko, and then you have Maya's, next step evolved DNA, going into Aya, and those are your opposing figures.
I will say that it's a little bit hard to like do like a full analysis of this because much like the book, I don't know that it 100% knows what it wants to say. Like, there are clearly some things here about freedom and liberation. I brought up that I think that the fight with Eve takes place in the ruins of the Statue of Liberty as being very interesting. With all of Eve's talk about freedom and liberation of the mitochondria from their host. There's something here to Aya's growth and evolution from learning that her sister who, the death of her sister, which has always kind of like played a big part in who she is and maybe a part of her passivity and being able to get beyond that to be able to defeat Eve and do as her mitochondria wants, which is to again protect humanity. I think that they're playing with a lot of interesting ideas here. I don't know that any of it comes together.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
And I also think it's interesting too that like, the game, much like the book, by the point we get to the end, everything has devolved into weird big action movie stuff. In the book, it's not as exciting watching a scientist like go from hospital to hospital to chase down Eve. Here we get a lot more like American film tropes with the American military comes in and Aya rides a helicopter. I will say the American military doing a Japanese style kamikaze, like sacrificing themselves so that Aya can get close. Uh, don't see the American military doing that one.
Hard no, but to be fair, I had some I had some opinions.
It is always interesting to see what Japan thinks of America and how they like work in areas of Japanese culture into these like American settings, and the way they do it with the police, Maeda's reaction to the things that he sees the police do, and the not just like the characters who exist within the police station, those NPCs, but also the American military that we get to meet in the game. It is fascinating.
Oh yes, but man, like gun culture, Japan did not understand American gun culture, especially on the police side at that time. I'm just gonna
Well,
say that.
I mean, I my one of my favorite segments, which is missable, and I don't know if it was in what you were watching, when there's a point in the game where you can optionally stop at a gun store or a pharmacy, and the gun store is locked, and so but like the city's been evacuated at this point, so Daniel just shoots the glass door, and Maeda's like, "Are you sure you're a cop?"
Yes, yes, I did catch that.
What were we talking about? Oh yeah, the ending.
The ending.
um, where you do fight the ultimate being, and I think it's interesting as well that the ultimate being is, very particularly male.
I
Like,
didn't think about that.
well, it starts as a baby, but, like, it kind of evolves as you're fighting it, which is a very JRPG trope.
Oh, yeah.
But by the time you get to the final form of it, it's like, a bodybuilder. It's just like this giant pecs, bald head, like, very male, and I again, like, thinking about they don't go into the explicits about this in the same way that they do in the book, but thinking about the book where, like, Eve is like a purely feminine being and mitochondria are gendered female, I think that the ultimate being, the combination of Clamp's engineered sperm and Eve and that union creating, like, this super masculine heavenly being. Again, I think that they're trying to play at something, though I'm not 100% sure what.
Yeah, that's a I don't know.
But we do get that one great scene of the special bullet with Aya's cells that Maeda made specifically for fighting Eve and the ultimate being, Daniel having to jump out of a helicopter, burst into flames to throw those bullets. We at least get that scene.
Oh, yeah.
So I feel like any ambiguity, anything that doesn't make sense, anything that just is a little bit strange can be forgiven
Agreed.
for that one segment.
Pure action.
One last thing to chat about before we wrap this up, and it really is like how this game ends as well as the post game. So here's my question to you, Lamont. What do you think happens at the end of Parasite Eve?
Okay. I didn't finish the Chrysler building, and
Right, right. I just the standard ending.
I'm still trying to figure that out because it definitely feels as though, like, everyone's mitochondria reacted to something, and I'm still like, all the red eyes, I'm still trying to figure out what the deal was with that.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like anything good.
No,
And
certainly not.
I think it's probably worth pointing out here. I've only ever played like the first hour of Parasite Eve 2, and that was around the time when it first came out. How much of Parasite Eve 2 did you play?
Same. I did not beat the first game, and then I played Parasite Eve 2 without having any context for, like, how the first one ended.
Right. Yeah, and then so I did beat the original Parasite Eve, and I beat the Chrysler Building as a kid, which I will never do again. I did not do that for this playthrough. We'll get there in a minute. So basically, the game ends with Aya and Daniel and Maeda and Daniel's son Ben all going to the opera again to actually see how the opera is supposed to go. There is a really cute moment where at the point in the story where everything burst into flames initially, like all the characters like stand up and get really paranoid and everyone's else like, "Can you sit down,
I
please?"
thought that was so funny.
It was very cute. And then, yeah, it switches to an FMV sequence with the, singer who is presumably not Melissa on stage singing opera, and then suddenly you see a little bit of Aya's mitochondria reacting, but they're red like Eve's mitochondria, not blue like you see when you see Aya's mitochondria normally. And then Aya's eyes go red, and then slowly the entire theater's eyes go red, like it's spreading. And then the lights dim, everyone's eyes are red, cut to credits. That's it.
Oh, you know what? Adrian, I think I get it.
Okay.
Knowing about the Chrysler building ending. I think it's probably the purebred Eve, like, or I guess Maya. I'm wondering if the red eye thing is her mitochondria calling out to Aya.
I could see that. I could see that.
Because we
I
now know that there's a new game plus ending. I think that's probably what it is that
you
it's
know, I actually like this read. I had read another read that was the mitochondria is always there or something like that thematically or whatever that like was like okay. The idea that like something bad happens after this doesn't really fit with the fact that there's a sequel. I like that read, and I'll tell you why. There is a moment in the hospital, like before you do the second round. This happens in any round when you see the first one, right? There is a cut where you actually see a close up outside of a window, and through that window you can see the Chrysler building glowing red. as
Oh.
sort of an allusion to what's going to happen. So I kinda like that read. Now, that being said, I actually don't know that Tokita, who again was the person who actually wrote this story, I don't think that they know either. I think it was just something fun that they did at the end, and they were just like, "What do you think?"
I mean, that's
Um,
fair.
that's the thing. So there is a second ending to the game, and Tokita and Sakaguchi and nobody has said one way or the other which one is canon. Well, let's talk about the second ending, let's talk about the post game. So, if you play the game again after this moment, just like a lot of games of this era, you get to like make a new save file and move it over. It's not a full new game plus like Chrono Trigger. You just get to keep one gun and one piece of armor, which you get to name during the finale of Parasite Eve. Presumably, you're going to do that with your best armor and your best gun. One thing that you can do is essentially fuse your old guns and your old armors with your new ones. And so there is sort of a evolution, quote unquote, evolutionary process that you go through every time you acquire a new weapon that you can like fuse it with your previous weapon, which you've put a lot of bonus points into and things like that. And that's how like essentially you can kind of customize your weapon and customize your armor in certain ways. So you get your one selected gun and one selected armor in the EX mode of the game. You start back at level 1, but now you have a superpowered gun and a superpowered piece of armor. Unfortunately, there is no way to skip cutscenes. You can skip FMV sequences, but you can't skip the long story dialogue. So you have to like go through a lot of dialogue again. Thankfully, the gameplay segments do not take very long. And once you get access to the world map, you get access to the Chrysler building. So this is a place that you can go. The way that the Chrysler building works as this sort of alternate dungeon is that it is 70 floors that get progressively harder each floor that you go to. Every 10 floors is a new boss. Most of the bosses are recaps of previous fights. There are a couple of original bosses. Problem is, number one, you have to play through a decent chunk of the game just to get to the Chrysler building. Problem two, about 5 or so floors in, you are probably not strong enough yet in the game to be able to go any further than the first 5 floors. So you basically need to play up to the museum before even being able to enter the Chrysler building. Problem number 3, each floor is randomly generated, rogue style. And again, it's all pre-rendered background, so you're basically just looking at the same like 12 rooms over and over and over again with no map. So you have to draw maps yourself. And again, if you leave and come back, those maps change. And it is one of the biggest slogs in any video game I think I have ever played. I imagine now, like, if you were to play this game, if you're going to do the Chrysler building, like, I hope you have, like, an old copy I hope you have a PlayStation Vita and the version that you could buy on the PSN store because that is and you just put on a good movie or something because that is the only way I could imagine making this even slightly bearable, which is not how I did it. I did it on an original PlayStation on a CRT television where I could have nothing else but me, the same music through these 70 gosh dang floors. It was heck and I hated it. And then your reward at the top of it is the actual final boss, a super boss, if you will. And we'll talk about who the super boss is in just a moment and everything, but you're probably not going to win that fight the first time that you get there. And what I would probably say is that by the time you get there, you're going to realize that you're going to need an even better weapon and an even better piece of armor that you've prepared specifically for this fight, which is probably going to necessitate another playthrough of the entire game.
Oh.
Because the super boss is that challenging. Now, again, if you do prepare properly, there is a way to like have like a super powerful weapon and be able to take no damage at the fight. So, like any other Square game, there are ways to break the game, but being able to do that again requires multiple playthroughs and preparing your weapon and armor in a very specific way that you know what you're doing. If you do make it through all of this, you end up in a room that looks a lot like there's a lot of bio-horror in terms of, like, how you see the mutated monsters and such, but it is not like the descriptions that are given in the book. The descriptions that are given in the book are stuff that is very Cronenberg-esque. This one room with a fleshy-looking cocoon in its center is probably the closest that we get to something that looks genuinely like Cronenberg. And what you discover inside of that cocoon, which breaks open, is Maya, quote unquote, Aya's twin sister. But it is not Maya. It is supposedly the original Eve, like the Eve from the book Eve. Again, similar to the book, is explained is not Maya necessarily. It's not even Maya's original body. It is, again, a recreation of Maya's body in the same way that it was a recreation of Kiyomi. And the idea is that Eve hid her original self in this cocoon at the top of the Chrysler building for as long as was there. Who knows? I guess as long as Aya's been dead, or Maya, I guess. Maya. So easy to confuse these two names. As long as Maya's been dead, there has just been this cocoon at the top of the Chrysler building that has stored the original Eve as sort of a backup plan should the ultimate being plan fail. Now, again, the way that I kind of have been thinking about this the entire time has been that, like, Eve is sort of a hive mind kind of thing. So in that way, I until this point in the game, I have always just thought of Melissa version of Eve as the original Eve. Because if the idea is that Mariko Anzai got Eve put into her through the kidney transplant with Kiyomi, and then that got transferred further into her children. I guess again it goes back to what you were saying, Lamont, about the fact that, like, because Maya and Aya were twins, they were Marika Anzai's original children. They are technically an evolution of Eve, not necessarily the same Eve. I guess you could see it that way. But supposedly this body of Eve is the original Eve.
Oh, that's so confusing.
It is so confusing and it makes no sense. Like,
Ugh.
none of this makes any sense. So you end up having to fight Eve, but the challenge is, of course, that you are, again, like, thinking about the movie, right? Thinking about the movie in that, like, it is Kiyomi, but it's actually Eve. Um, by killing Eve, you are essentially shooting at your own twin sister who goes through a evolution that looks kind of like the ultimate being, which also looks like a form that Aya can take in her, like, last special attack, basically her version of Omni Slash, which is very angelic looking. That's the final fight with you fighting Maya, or at least Eve's form of Maya. And then you don't technically beat it when you beat the fight. What happens is Maya takes over Eve in a similar vein to Kiyomi taking over Eve at the end of the movie, which is again what I thought was very interesting
Yeah.
about the fact that is this a sequel to the movie or is this a sequel to the book? And again, I shrug and you can't see it.
Why not both?
Why not both, I guess. But there is a sacrifice that is needed, which is that now Aya gets to communicate with Maya. Essentially, now that Maya has, like, stopped Eve from taking over and has regained control over original Eve, Maya now lives inside of Aya's brain, essentially, at the sacrifice of both of their mitochondrial powers. So the implication of this ending is that Aya goes back to being a normal human being, but is able to live forever with her lost sister. But you also don't actually finish the game, so technically Melissa, I guess, is still out there. I don't know. All I know is that there has never been a conclusive answer one way or the other which of these is the canon ending. I assume because Aya still has all of her powers in Parasite Eve 2, that it is the original ending or it's some combination of the 2. Kinda like how in the original Resident Evil, like, you can't save both Rebecca and Barry, but they're both alive in Resident Evil canon. I
Yeah.
assume it's probably some mix of the 2, or Like, there is just a little bit more lore information that you get out of this extra ending. What I can say is it's not like there's, like, any great big FMV scene. It's not like there's any, like, amazing revelations or any real rewards for the slog that is the Chrysler Building. Instead, you just get a answers that just really lead to more weird questions.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to play the second game now.
Yeah, no, for sure. We're definitely gonna return to the sequel, in this podcast eventually, but that's Parasite Eve. To wrap this up, I think that when you put it in the context of the success of the novel in Japan, the success of Resident Evil, the direction that like everyone's going to, because there are other RPGs that are horror RPGs inspired by Resident Evil that we'll one day talk about on this podcast. One day we will cover Kodelka. I don't really think Parasite Eve is that surprising. Again, there is sort of the question of like why license a novel, and I think it really is just the novel was popular and Square wanted its own Resident Evil. I don't know that it goes any deeper than that. Again, someone out there ask Hironobu Sakaguchi. I really loved this game. Again, I think it survives on vibes more than anything else. I think there is a good reason. Like we didn't talk too much about like the actual reception of this game. It was a sales success. It sold the rough estimate people give is about 3 million copies, which for 1998 is incredible. It's not Final Fantasy VII numbers, but it's still really good. Reviews wise, critically, the game got a lot of sixes and sevens out of tens. I think those are fair scores.
Yeah.
I love this game. I think it's a lot of fun. And again, the vibes are impeccable, the music is incredible, the look and feel is spectacular. At one point, like when I got to the sewers that Lamont mentioned, and I saw like that screen of the giant archways that have again kind of this kind of gothic feel. My first thought was, man, video games used to look so good. That being said, it's also somewhat simple. The level design or dungeon design isn't great. The one time it does kind of play at Resident Evil with locks and keys and puzzles, it's very perfunctory. Again, it is a sequel to a novel that most people have not read, a novel that is much like the story of this game, fine. Honestly, in some ways, I think this game's story is more of a mess than the novel. Um, but I also don't think it matters. And it's still also very, very playable. Of all the 7 out of 10 RPGs I can think of, most of those are 7 out of 10s because their character customization isn't that deep, their battle systems aren't that fun. I don't think any of that applies here. I think, like, the biggest thing gameplay is that it's just kinda thin. So I totally understand why this game got 7s and out of 10s at the same time, that I understand why it was also a success as well. There's a lot to love here. There's a lot to definitely reflect on now in 2024 when we have access to the novel, when we have a better understanding of Japanese culture. Totally think this is one that is worth your time to revisit. Just don't do the Chrysler Building. I don't know. That's what I got. You got anything else to add, Lamont?
I don't have much more to add. I once again, anybody that wants to go back to this game, take the time to watch the movie. Yes, the game gives you a speed run of like the details from the movie from Maeda, but A, that happens later in the game once he gets introduced, and B, I think that if you watch the movie and then go into the game, right from the beginning, you already have so much more perspective and there's so much more spectacle when it comes to the game. So I think this is a game that's well worth going back to and exploring. Uh, I agree with Adrian. Avoid the Chrysler Building. It's not necessary. But I will say, if you don't want to read the book, pacing, time, whatever that looks like, watch the movie. It's not a long movie. It does have some. It's kind of like the book, and there's some slow burn, but it's when it picks up, when it does its action stuff, it's riveting, and it will give you such a better appreciation of the game. The game really does survive on vibes. really talking about story, it is very thin. There's really not much there. A lot of the science is dry, but at the same time, doesn't make it not fun. So I would say, you know, absolutely go back, check it out. Now that I've revisited this, I definitely plan on checking out the second game. Not just because there's a gunblade and I am a gunblade enthusiast, um, but there is a gunblade in the second game, so And then maybe I'll check out Third Birthday. I heard Third Birthday not the greatest, but still, I want to come back to this franchise.
Fun game. Everything else is awful about Third Birthday. I love the battle system and I like playing it, but everything else is terrible. Everything surrounding that game is bad.
Good
That's
to
that's
know.
that's my take on Third Birthday, which is funny because I actually have played more of that than I've played Parasite Eve 2. I should also say my understanding of it is that Parasite Eve 2 is a direct sequel to Parasite Eve, and Third Birthday is more of a spinoff. We are going to cover both games eventually on this podcast. So we will definitely play Parasite Eve 2. Probably not for another year or so, but we will play it. We will cover it on this podcast eventually. We will return to this series, but for now, I guess it's time to talk about what's up for next month.
All right, Adrian. So next month, next month is going to be a fun one because we are going to check out a game that is very much inspired by games that we've talked about in the past. It is one of our newer ones, so that should be fun. We've talked a lot about old games, but next month we're going to talk about Homebody.
Yeah, a new game trying to be an old game, but I agree. I'm really excited to check this one out. I don't actually know that much about it other than like I really like the look and feel of it. And yeah, it does seem to be some kind of combination of Silent Hill, Resident Evil, and even like a little bit of Parasite Eve in the sci-fi aspect, if not so much the gameplay aspect. So it'll be nice to cover something kind of new for once. This will be our first time doing that on this podcast, even if, again, it is a sort of a retro throwback. So be sure to be on the lookout for that one next month. And yeah, we will see you all then.
My name is Lamont Williams,
And I'm Adrian Sandoval.
and this was Playing Dread. Thank you again for listening.
You've been listening to Playing Dread, a Q27 media production and a member of the New Jersey Horror Collective, hosted by Lamont Williams and Adrian Sandoval. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends, or just consider leaving us a review and giving us top ranks on your podcast listening service of choice. Check out our show notes at playingdread.libsym.com and consider becoming a Playing Dread patron on Patreon. Social media links including YouTube, Blue Sky, Instagram, and more can be found at www.playingdread.com. All music is under a Creative Commons Attribution license. The intro music is The Curse of the Dolls by Jeff Harvey, and other music in this episode was performed by Alex Grohl, Dimitri Taras, Grand Project, and Pump Up the Mind.